I want to welcome everyone here this morning. We hope you enjoyed your week off, but that hopefully it was a profitable week, and that maybe you caught up a little bit as to some of your work. I hope that all of the work is going well. We're a little bit behind as far as where we needed to be in our study, so I'm going to change a little bit as to the way in which we've been going through, and instead of reading every verse, we won't do that. We'll discuss the verses without reading them so much. But some of them we will deal with more, and then some of it we'll skip to a certain extent, kind of skip over, because like the listing of the kings and the listing of cities and things like that. But we were in chapter 11. We had gotten down to about verse 20. If you remember, the 11th chapter is dealing with the northern campaign. Jabin's alliance with Israel is what we see in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 11. Then in verses 6 through 9, we see Israel's defeat of Jabin. Then in verses 10 through verse 14, we have the fact that Hazor is burned. And then we were in that section of the fact that Joshua is faithful to his commission, verses 15 through 20. As I said, we'd gotten down to verse 20. And in that we were discussing the idea of God hardening their hearts. That God could have miraculously destroyed them, but God wanted them to fight for their own existence, as far as Israel fighting for their own existence. And this provides them a way of doing that. When we start seeing about God hardening their hearts, we also see this with Pharaoh and how that God had hardened Pharaoh's heart. In several passages in Exodus, it mentions God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I'll read over these real quick, or not read the verses, but the location: Exodus 4 and verse 21, Exodus 7 and verse 3, verse 13, verse 14, and verse 22, Exodus 8 and verse 19, Exodus 9, verses 7, verse 12, verse 35, Exodus 10 and verse 1, verse 20, and verse 27, Exodus 11 and verse 10, Exodus 14, verses 4, verse 8, and verse 17. But that's where it states that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Likewise, it mentions the fact that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. In Exodus 8, verse 15, and verse 32, and Exodus 9 and verse 34. And as you'll recall, Moses, along with Aaron, went to Pharaoh with the instructions, "Let Israel go." And this word of God brought about Pharaoh's hardening his heart. Pharaoh did not believe God, and thus rejected God and his word. So basically, he hardened his own heart by failing to respect God's will in the matter. That God had made the man's own Pharaoh, which Pharaoh was unwilling to accept. Then when the plagues came, instead of making him compliant to the will of God, the plagues very simply made him angry with God's demands. And so it was in this way God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In the same manner as we have now before us with these nations, in the same way God hardened these nations' heart. Instead of submitting to God's will, they rebelled against God. And since God is one who had ordained this, it is said that God hardened their hearts. By their open rebellion to God and retaining their wickedness, in reality, they hardened their own hearts. Now then, in verses 21 through verse 23 of chapter 11, Joshua cuts off the Anakims. And as I say, we're not going to, for time's sake, we're not going to read all of these verses, but we'll comment on the ones that we want to deal with and without reading them. In verse 21, we have there basically Joshua cutting off the Anakims from the mountainous area and utterly destroying them. Now these are the people in the area that caused at least part of the reason the 10 spies who were sent out by Moses that they gave for not being able to take the land. If you go back to Numbers, the 13th chapter, and verses 32 and verse 33, they gave this area and this as part of the reason that we cannot take the land. Land's too powerful. Those 10 spies did not realize God would be with them and God would help them overcome this area. On the other hand, Joshua, and when Joshua and Caleb went in with the spies, they realized that God would be with them. Joshua had faith to overcome them, and he does that. In verse 22, he states that none of the Anakims were left except for those in other nations, and he mentions Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Verse 23 says, So Joshua took the whole land according to all that Jehovah said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from war. Now this is one of the key verses in Joshua. And there's 5 things which we want to notice about this verse. The first of those is that Joshua took the whole land. Joshua took the whole land. It is not just a part of the land, but it's the entirety of the land. This is the fulfillment of the land promise that God made to Abraham, and that was repeated to Isaac and to Jacob, that they would and that he would give them the land. So now then we're seeing the fulfillment of that. And this is a statement that shows God gave them the land, not just part of the land, he gave them all of the land, the whole land. Second, we see that it was according to what God told Moses, and we would see that in Exodus 23 in verses 27 through verse 33, and Deuteronomy 7 in verse 22. So this was being done according to God's Word. And thus we see in this, God's promises are being fulfilled. This is one of the great things that we see throughout the book of Joshua and throughout the entirety of the Bible, that God's promises are always fulfilled. God does what he says to do, that he's going to do. Third statement in this is that we see Joshua gave the land for an inheritance to Israel. The statement of God giving them the land for an inheritance always refers to that land west of Jordan. God and Joshua gave it for an inheritance. So, fourth, along that line, we see that Joshua divides the land by the differing tribes. And we will get into that in that section of the consigning of the land. But here's a general statement now of Joshua dividing the land. And then fifth idea that is presented for us in this verse is that the land had rest from war. Now, that may seem odd, but he's dealing with here the major battles, that those major battles were over with at this point in time. Now, there were still within the territory individuals that needed to be eradicated from the land of Canaan. And the individual tribes, as he would assign them the land, would have the responsibility to go in and take care of the rest of those people that remain there. And so, sadly, after the assigning of the tribes, many of the Canaanites were still allowed to remain in the land, and their influence caused a great deal of problems for the Israelites in years to come. But here in chapter 11:23, we have one of these key verses in Joshua. Chapter 12 now. We have the summary of the conquered cities. A summary of these conquered cities. In the first 6 verses, we have the land taken on the east side. This would be the east side of Jordan. And if you look in verse 1 here, he mentions the other side of Jordan. Anytime we come to that idea of the other side of Jordan, it's always talking about the east side of Jordan. And on this east side of Jordan, then, he gives the boundaries from the general boundaries. The territory extended from the Arnon River to Mount Hermon and included the plain of Jordan. In verse 2, he talks about the area that King Sihon controlled. And he mentions the Sea of Chinnereth, or Chinneroth. That's better known by us as the Sea of Galilee. In verse 4 and following, he deals with the area that King Og controlled, King Og of Bashan, the area that he controlled. Verse 6, this area then had been given to the 2.5 tribes, that is, the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. Now then, we have also, and we should realize that the reception of this land by these 2.5 tribes was contingent upon their going into on the rest of, or the west side of Jordan, and fighting with their brethren. If they wanted this land, they still had the responsibility of going into the west side with their brethren, fighting the battles and helping their brethren take that land. Also, the land on the east side of Jordan is always spoken of as the land which Moses gave the people, as opposed to the land on the west side of Jordan being spoken of as the land which Joshua gave. And so there, as you read through, if you're seeing here's the land that Moses gave, you always know that's the land on the east side of Jordan. If it's talking about the land that Joshua gave, that's on the west side of Jordan. Now then, in verses 7 and verse 8 of chapter 12, we have the land that had been taken on the west side of Jordan. So the land on the west side. And in verse 7, he mentions this side of Jordan. And again, this is that west side. And he sets forth the boundaries of it. It extended about 180 miles north to south. Mount Halak is located about 40 miles to the southwest of the Dead Sea. And the Valley of Lebanon was in the north. So there's the area in which he's dealing with. And in verse 8 there, he mentions that the major nations that had been taken as had been set forth to God, basically, back in Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21, that this now had been taken. These nations were an idolatrous, evil, cruel people. And as such, that's one of the reasons that they were being destroyed and that they were to be destroyed, because they were wicked and idolatrous. They were a cruel people. And thus God gives them the responsibility. You destroy them. It was a righteous judgment of God upon these nations. And we need to remember that as we read through and as we study through why God had these nations destroyed. And it answers some of these quibbles and that individuals will bring up about charging God with killing these people. Well, it is a righteous judgment of God against the people, those people. Now then, in verses 9 through verse 24, we have a listing of the 31 kings that had been taken. Remember, as you go through this list, and we are not going to read through it or detail it at this point in time, but remember as you go through this how that Israel took the land. That first they go into the central section, then they go south and have a south campaign to destroy the people there. Then they move to the north and take the northern campaign. And so as you go through this list of the 31 kings, they're basically set forth in the order in which Joshua takes the land or defeats these nations. Butler writes this concerning that the description was not complete. Shechem is not mentioned, and the hills of Ephraim are sparsely represented, as is the territory north of Hazor. Completeness is not the object. The writer seeks to compile a list that will impress the readers with the greatness of the feat of God in working for Israel and of the greatness of the leadership of Joshua in following the example of Moses and completing the task first given to Moses. Still, the writer is aware that much remains to be done. And I think that's a fairly accurate assessment of what we're seeing here in this listing of the kings. Now then, we come to the next major section of Joshua, and that is the consigning of the land, and that's dealing with chapters 13 through chapter 22, the consigning of the land. In chapter 13 and the first 7 verses, we have a listing of the land that is yet to be conquered, or the land not yet conquered. And verse 1 mentions the fact that there's been some time now that has passed, and Joshua is getting on up in the years. At this point in time, and states that he was old and stricken in years, he's probably around or in his 80s. And yet there was still land which needed to be taken. God reminds Joshua of this. And by mentioning this, that you're old and stricken in years, and yet there's much land that needs to be taken, God is encouraging Joshua, you continue taking the land. Continue on the course to take everything. And reminding him of his age would show the urgency of going ahead and taking all of the land. And again, the land had been conquered, but there were still people living in the land, which as a result, they had not possessed those areas within the land, even though, again, they were controlling the entirety of the land. They had conquered the major cities and the major kings, but there's still these people there. And Israel still had the obligation. You drive them out. You destroy them. And as the land is going to be divided, each of the tribes had that responsibility. Drive out the remaining people. Of course, they didn't always do this. He, in verse 2, talks about the land that still remains. The region of the Philistines would be that southern or southwestern part of the Promised Land. And as we remember through the history of the Israelites from this time onward, the failure to drive out the Philistines really caused them a great deal of heartache throughout the years. And if there's probably one nation that caused more difficulties for Israel, it might be the Philistines and any other nation or any other people. And so their failure to destroy the Philistines during this period of time really becomes a thorn in their side. Verse 3, he mentions Sihor, which is probably the brook of Egypt, the modern, and I'm not sure I'll pronounce this right, but Wadi El Arish. And y'all can see that in the chat room better than I can pronounce it. But it's basically marking the southwest boundary. And he also in this gives a listing of the 5 Philistine cities. In verse 4, Sidon may represent the inhabitants of the Phoenician coast and of the Lebanon mountains. The land of the Gibeonites refers to the city-state of Byblos. While Israel had, again, subdued the land, there was still a lot of it that was not under their control. And what we see in the church today, you start something and people grow weary with it. There's not the continued enthusiasm, and people quit doing and working the program. I think that's what we're seeing in relationship to Israel here. They started growing weary in the battle and driving people out. And it was easier for them, very simply, just to do away and to put them in subjugation, and as we're going to see, start taking taxes from them instead of doing what God wanted them to do, and very possibly because they just became weary in doing it. In verse 6 here, we again notice that the promise that God would drive out all these people. Now then, we saw in the last verse of chapter 12 chapter 11, how that God had given them all the land. God was faithful to His promise. God always fulfills His promise. But they had to do their part also. And as they would drive these people out, God would be with them. God would assure their victory, even as He had over Jericho and over these other other people and kings, and even as those kings banded together to try to defeat them, God would assure victory. And in control over the promised land probably reached its height during the reigns of David and Solomon. And if you look at 2 Kings chapter 8 and verse 3, it should be 2 Samuel 8 and verse 3. I think I said Kings there. And 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 21, you see the promised land and control over that area reaching its height during that period of time. Now then, also, the latter part of verse 6, the land was to be divided up by lots to the Israelites for their inheritance. Doing it by lots would make this impartial. Someone could not come to Joshua and say, well, Joshua, you favored this tribe over us. You gave them a better land than you did us. It ensures that there's no favoritism, and also that there's no fraud that would be involved. Plus, God was going to be controlling the lots. God thus dividing the land as He saw fit. And also included the promise west of the Jordan, since the 2.5 tribes had received their land on the other side. Now then, in verses 8 through verse 14, we get to that area of the inheritance on the east side. In verse 8, we see that Moses gave again those 2.5 tribes their land. In verse 9, it was from Aroer on the banks of the Arnon River to Dibon, which included the plain of Medeba. In verse 10, the Ammonites' territory was east of the land of Reuben and Gad. It was east of the land which they possessed. Verse 12, Bashan is where Og ruled, King Og. And Manasseh inherited that land, inherited the land of Bashan. Og was, and he mentions here in verse 12, one of the giants that remain. And we see, according in Deuteronomy 3 and verse 11, how that he had a bed that was 9 cubits in length by 4 cubits in width. 9 cubits would equal out to about 13.5 feet. 4 cubits would be 6 feet. So he had a bed that was 13.5 by 6 feet. Huge man, one of the giants. Verse 13 of chapter 13 is another key verse. It says, nevertheless, the children of Israel expelled not the Gershurites, nor the Machratharites, but the Gershurites and the Machratharites dwelt among Israelites until this day. This shows that Israel was failing in their duty to drive out the people. God had told Moses to drive out the enemy totally, but here they're not doing it. So these people are dwelling among them. And he mentions these 2 people in particular, remaining in the land, even to the time at which Joshua was written. They were there, and they had not driven them out. God knew the type of influence these nations would have on Israel. That's another one of the reasons that God commanded, drive them out from the land. Leaving them in the land causes their downfall. That's what we see in the book of Judges to a great extent. Judges is all about the fact that they failed to drive out the people that were living in the land. And those people that thus became a thorn in their side, they influenced them in their wickedness. And that's really what God had prophesied. God had told them, you drive them out, because if you don't, they will become thorns in your sides. And look at Numbers 33, verses 55 and verse 56. And we really see this dealing with, now we'll see it dealing with several of the tribes of Israel in that they did not drive out their enemy. In verse 14, we have the tribe of Levi being mentioned, and the fact that Levi did not receive an inheritance in the land. Their inheritance was the sacrifices which Israel was going to be made. That is the idea of being supported by other tribes, because they were going to be doing service at the altar. That was their work. The other tribes did not, they did not receive a land inheritance. They received God as theirs, and thus Moses, we'll see in verse 33 where Moses did not give them any inheritance, but that God, it's mentioned, was their inheritance. And we see that also in Numbers, the 18th chapter, verse 31, or verse 21, how that God is their inheritance. Later on, we're going to see that 48 cities are given to them as their cities, but they were not given a territory per se. And they were going to be engaged in the religious activities and their priestly work, and that's why they were not given a land, and they were going to be supported by the people. In chapter 13, verses 15 through verse 23, we now have the land given to the Reubenites. And he mentions in verse 15 that the southern part is on the east side of Jordan, and we'll kind of give an overview of this. And there's going to be on this east side of Jordan, there's going to be one city of refuge in each one of these three areas. Skipping down to verse 22, I want to mention that one in particular because it mentions Balaam also, the son of Beor, the soothsayer, did the children of Israel slay with the sword among them that were slain by them. So in the process of destroying Sion, they also slew Balaam. Now Balaam was the prophet that Balak had hired. He hired Balaam, come and curse the children of Israel for me. And we see that being recorded in Numbers chapters 22 through chapter 25. And at first Balaam said no, that he could not curse them because God had blessed them. And he continued with that. However, he told Balak, here's how you can get God to curse the children of Israel, if you will get them to intermarry with you. And because of the advice of Balaam, it brought about an evil, and God putting to death many of the Israelites. So this was an evil man. And we read in Numbers 31 and verse 8 how that Balaam was killed during Israel's battle with the Midianites. In chapter 13 verses 24 through verse 28, we have the land given to the Gadites. The land given to the Gadites. This was in the central part on the east side of Jordan. This basically went from the northern part of the Dead Sea to the southern part of the Sea of Galilee. So that area of the east side of Jordan. Then in verses 29 through verse 32, we have the land given to the half-tribe of Manasseh. And in verse 29, or in these verses, this is the northern part on the east side of Jordan. From the southern part of the Sea of Galilee to Mount Hermon. In verse 33, we again go back to the Levites and their inheritance. And in this verse, he again mentions that they did not receive a land, but the fact that God was their inheritance, as we mentioned just a moment ago. They did receive 48 cities, but they did not receive a territory. Of those 48 cities, 6 of those cities are cities of refuge, and I doubt that we'll get into those cities of refuge today, but hopefully we will next week. Because of the service that they rendered, the Levites rendered from a spiritual standpoint, there was no land that was going to be given to them. And read more about that in Numbers, the 18th chapter, verses 20 and 21. Campbell wrote about this, that the 2.5 tribes chose as Lot did on the basis of appearance. And he mentions, compare Genesis 13, verses 10 and 11. And their inheritance was ultimately lost to them. Compare 1 Chronicles 5 and verse 26. On the other hand, the Levites, requesting no portion, were given an inheritance of abiding spiritual significance. And so we see that comparison being made here. Now then, in chapter 14, we have Caleb's inheritance. Caleb's inheritance. And in verses 1 through 5, we have the inheritance on the west side is going to be set forth by Lot. In verse 1, he's going to deal with the land which was going to be distributed to the 9.5 tribes. And he mentions Eleazar the priest, along with Joshua, and the heads of the fathers were going to make distribution of the land. Eleazar could be understood basically as their spiritual leader. Joshua basically was their civil leader. And then along with the heads of the fathers of the tribes. So basically, we're dealing with the leaders of the people, or the ones who are going to be involved in this. Numbers 34 and verse 17 gives us a list of those leaders. Constable wrote about this, that apparently the casting of lots established the general location of each tribe within Canaan, but the population of that tribe affected the size of each tribe's inheritance. Compare Numbers 26, 52 through 56. Verse 2 sets forth the process by which this is going to be done. It was to be distributed by lot. And we mentioned earlier that this shows the impartiality of it. Also, doing it by lot would indicate that it was being done by God. Casting of lots was actually done or used for different means. Among such was, we see in Acts 1, verses 15 and 16, for example, determining the will of God. Then we also see in Leviticus the 16th chapter that it would be used for determining the goat that would be used in sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. We see in Joshua the 7th chapter how that it would be used for determining who had sinned and taking the devoted things, those things that had been devoted from Jericho, and thus a curse to the people, how that it was used to determine who it was who took those devoted things. Here we see that it was being used to determine the assigning of the land. Verse 3, it mentions again how that Moses had given the 2.5 tribes on the other side of Jordan their land, and the fact that the Levites did not receive a land inheritance. Verse 4 mentions the 2 sons of Joseph now will each receive a part of the land. That would again make 12 divisions of the land. Since the Levites received cities in which to live instead of a land, that would have taken the division to 11, but since the 2 sons of Joseph each received a land, it takes it back to 12 divisions. And the Levites receiving cities in which to live for, he mentions their cattle. Verse 5, we again see this as being done as God commanded Moses. And thus the Israelites in this were simply following what Moses had instructed as set forth by God. In verses 6 through verse 15 now, chapter 14, we have Caleb's inheritance of Hebron. In verse 6, he mentions Gilgal. This is still where the main encampment was. Their basic headquarters was still here. This is the beginning of the request by Caleb to Joshua, because the promise that Moses made to him for the good report. You remember, Moses sent these 12 spies into the land, Numbers 13 and chapters 13 and 14. God sent these 12 spies. Caleb, along with Joshua, came back with a positive report that we can go in and take the land. Because of that positive report by Joshua and Caleb, Moses promised them a specific land. Well, Caleb now is reminding Joshua of the promise, which Joshua very well knew about. Caleb, he mentions, was the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. And that idea of the Kenizzite shows that Caleb probably was not a full-blooded Israelite. Instead, his ancestral line would go back to Kenaz. And you can look at 1 Chronicles, the 4th chapter, verses 13 through 15 in relationship to that ancestral line of Caleb. Verse 7, when Caleb was sent, he was 40 years old to spy out the land. He brought back a report, we're able to take the land, Numbers 13 and verse 30 in particular. And it mentions here something important. He truly believed the report that he brought back. It was a report that was, it says, in his heart. It wasn't something that was fake with him. It wasn't a hypocritical report. It wasn't something that he half-hearted believed. Maybe that, well, I know that God says we can take the land, but since he said it, I guess we can. But he doesn't really believe it in his heart. Indicates he really did believe this. When we obey God, our obedience, we would see in Romans 6, verse 17 and 18, must be from the heart. We obey from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto us. If our obedience is not from the heart, it's not true obedience. That obedience has to be there. Joe mentioned, so Caleb was a stranger that came out of Egypt. That's probably accurate. He would be one of those strangers that came out of Egypt with the Israelites and thus became an Israelite, since he was, as mentioned here, a Kenizzite. In verse 8, it mentions again the 10 spies caused the people's heart not to believe God and to think that they could not take the land. Caleb, however, did what God wanted him to do. And it states that Caleb wholly followed God. What a great statement concerning anyone. How that they totally, wholly followed God. There wasn't anything held back. And that again is how we need to be in our Christianity. We need to totally or wholly follow God. In verse 9, it talks about the fact Moses giving Caleb a promise of the land that he would spying out would be his. And we would see that in Deuteronomy 1 in verse 36. And again in Numbers 14, verses 26 through verse 38. However, in that, Moses did not specify the allotment of all the tribes, but he promised Caleb that his inheritance would be in that land that he spied out. And now then, in verse 10, God had kept Caleb alive, and now then he was 85 years old. Constable mentions about this in relationship to his age, that the references to Caleb's age enable us to determine the length of the conquest of Canaan. Caleb had received the promise of a portion of the land at Kadesh Barnea 38 years before the Israelites crossed the Jordan and entered Canaan, Numbers 14:24. Caleb was 40 years old then, verse 7. He was now 85, verse 10. 45 years had elapsed, and Caleb had spent 38 of them in the wilderness. Therefore, the conquest must have taken the remaining 7 years. In verse 11, Caleb mentions that he had retained his strength, that he could still go to war and defeat the enemy. Remember that while the land had been taken as a whole, there were still cities and people that needed to be driven out. So he is saying, I'm still able to go to war, I'm still able to do this, and driving out the enemy, even though he was 85 years old. Verse 12, thus Caleb asked for the mountain, that even though he is 85 years old. One of the great lessons I think we can learn from this is that that even when we get older, it does not mean that we have to quit. That we can and we must remain faithful to God. In fact, as we grow older, our faith in God should be growing stronger and stronger. And also, when we get older, just because we are getting older does not mean that we can retire from our service to God. God had Caleb had trusted in God that he would help him to drive out any remaining people. And I don't know if y'all can hear my cell phone going off, but that's what that is, so just kind of ignore that for a few. And verse 13, I forgot to put it on silent. Verse 13, Joshua blessed Caleb and gave him Hebron. Hebron was about 19 miles south-southwest of Jerusalem, about 3,040 foot above sea level. It was the location of the cave of Machpelah where Abraham was buried. This was within the tribe of Judah's land, which was his tribe. It was also the area which had discouraged his fellow spies. Well, it's about 10 till, so we'll stop here and take our break at this point and start up again at 10 o'clock.